This is the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast, the podcast where we look at our times through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. Hey, before I dive into our topic for this episode, I want to make sure that you know that I team up with a bunch of fine coaches of men for a podcast called the Great Man Podcast. You will find that wherever podcasts are promoted and listed and offered and selected. And I want you to get it. If you're a man, if you care about men, if you raise men, if you plan to marry a man, if you know a man, we want you to listen to the Great Man Podcast. It's really one of the finest podcasts for men. It's rising rapidly in the ratings. It's having a lot of influence. It's structured this way. I do the quote-unquote talk, which lasts maybe 10 or 15 minutes, challenging men, teaching men, bringing something from the news about men. And then two of the finest men's coaches I know, Anthony Flemons and JT McCraw, they then coach it into men. They do the segment we call The Build, the talk and the build. And it's really having an impact. Occasionally we'll do an interview with somebody prominent. We've interviewed George Foreman, etc. But you want to get this. So make sure if you're listening to this podcast, 10 or 15 minutes on public policy from Stephen Mansfield's perspective, make sure that you're also paying attention to and encouraging others to listen to the Great Man Podcast. You can also go to our website at greatman.tv, and Great Man is also the name of our Twitter feed, etc., our X feed, we should call it now. Now, I would like to dive into something that's been very much in the news. I have unusual opinions about it that, as usual, are somewhere between left and right, but it's not that I land there because I can't decide what I believe. It's because I'm connected to this subject personally. I see it, I live it, I see it 360, and I think that we are at a moment of crisis regarding the subject. And let me tell you what it is. It's Washington, D.C. I live in Washington, D.C. Let me tell the truth. I live just over the line of Washington, D.C., actually technically in Virginia, in Alexandria. I'm 5-minute walk from a metro station. I'm within the Beltway, but outside the district. So I say I live in Washington, D.C., live and work, and I do work there. Technically, I live over the line and don't actually live in Washington, D.C. So I want to tell the truth about that and make sure I'm clear. But I love D.C. It is definitely my city, one of my cities, along with Nashville. I live in two cities, and I'm crazy about D.C. I'm crazy about the history. I'm crazy about the architecture. I'm crazy about the people. I'm crazy about the multinational composition of it. I love the conversations I have. I love the food. I love the events. I love getting down and dirty with my friends there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I even, and I hope I can continue this season, love the football team. So I'm crazy about D.C. However, from a governmental perspective, we've got some confusion. And Donald Trump has put his big old foot right in the middle of it by federalizing the police of Washington, D.C., going after criminals in Washington, D.C., calling it a hellhole, and being embarrassed by what it looks like to the international community that comes to D.C. for all kinds of things governmental. So I want to dive into this a little bit, provide some historical background, tell you what I believe going to be surprising to you, and make sure that we're all up to speed on this. And I'm hoping to do all this in the next 10 minutes. How's that for drama in a podcast? So the Founding Fathers originally intended that there be a federal city that was not part of any state, but that was where the federal government would be contained. They did this for several reasons. We had a United States capital in several other cities, Philadelphia, New York. And what happened was that the local state, the local community pressured the federal government, sought to control the federal government for its purposes. And the Founding Fathers realized that we needed to have a capital that was free of that kind of control and intrusion and domination and hassle. So in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the Founding Fathers established that Congress had ultimate authority to govern the District of Columbia, it was called, and this authority would include the power to create a federal district, quote, not to exceed 10 miles square. So that was the idea. You had a city, 10 miles square maximum, that would be governed by Congress, and it would be free of any kind of local state intrusion, control, or interference. Great idea. And Washington, D.C. thus was born. Now, it continued basically under Congress for better part of a century and a half, quite a while. And it did not work that well. There were benefits to it. In fact, there's a fun theory in history that the federal government began to grow in size when you began to air condition the buildings and drain the swamp, physically the swamp, because D.C. is built on very swampy land that's now been drained, etc. But people didn't want to, the elected leaders didn't want to stay in D.C. very long. It was malarial. It was swampy. It was hot. It was feverish. It wasn't a great place to be. But it grew up over time. And finally, of course, with World War II, really is when D.C. began to come into its own. I would recommend David Brinkley's book, Washington Goes to War. Really, World War II is the birth of modern Washington, D.C., with all the federal buildings and with development, and thank Jesus, with air conditioning. I'm not being sacrilegious. I'm saying I'm very grateful. D.C. can be swampy hot like almost nowhere in America. And so you had the growth of a city, basically, of course, since the Constitution, but with World War II, we really began to have what we know as modern D.C., but it was governed by Congress. And this did not work very well, and it was Congress's fault. Part of the reason it didn't work well was that, of course, you had congressmen from, let's say, Arizona, who would be on the committee governing Washington, D.C., and they'd be getting phone calls about potholes and panhandlers and crime problems and so on in a city they weren't really even that connected to. They lived across the country. They were only on a committee. They didn't spend much time in the city, and yet they were responsible for its governance. So the people of D.C. weren't well served, and of course the congressmen themselves were just over it, tired of getting calls about things they didn't know anything about. So by the time you come to the early 1970s, you begin to have the culmination of a movement for home rule, meaning that D.C. gets to rule itself. Well, fine, but what happened was that there began to be a movement amongst the citizens of D.C. There began to be a movement amongst those who wanted to govern and rule D.C. There began to be a movement in Congress for home rule, that D.C. would rule itself. Now, Congress should have gone a different way. I'm going to tell you straight up, and this is a fairly radical opinion, but hear me out. I'm not in favor of home rule. But in 1973, Congress passed a bill for home rule. Richard Nixon, who was besieged by Watergate problems and would be out of office within months, signed it. I think he was pandering. And as a result, you had home rule. Okay? So now, rather than Congress doing what it should have done, let me freeze 1973. Rather than going for home rule, Congress should have created a government branch of Congress to govern D.C. well, rather than having busy congressmen from across the country who were too busy with other things that didn't really care that much about the locality. Congress should have fulfilled its constitutional obligations, formed a D.C. governmental body that was focused on it, could have been a nice combination of private entities and government entities, and you could have developed the city beautifully. Now, it's a great city. It's a beautiful city. I love it, as I've said many times, but it hadn't been governed all that well up to 1973. But Nixon's in political trouble. Congress is fed up, and so they appoint home rule. And so you're going to have a mayor, you're going to have a committee, you're going to have a city council, all the things that look like the governing of a big city, but don't really give them full power. Still the president can intrude according to law. Still Congress can intrude, etc. And by the way, the citizens of D.C., according to this home rule bill, would not have any direct political representation in Congress. They have people who are observers, but they don't have people who can actually vote. This was a mistake. It didn't serve the people of D.C. well. It didn't serve Congress well. It didn't serve the nation well. So now you have a government that is basically a partial city government ruling the now far less than 10 square miles of Washington, D.C. Let me tell you quickly, by the way, that even though D.C. is known as a prominently black city, and at the time of home rule, it was one of the most black-controlled cities in America, majority black in America, it's not majority black. It's slightly less than black population. D.C. has about 675,000 people in it. Less than half are African-American. It's also a very, very transitory city. For example, I'm technically a city of, like I say, just over the line from Washington, D.C., but I'm only there half the time. That's the way it is in D.C. Congressmen, senators, military, diplomatic staff, people there on internships, etc. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are in the district but don't really have any roots there. Now, a lot of the African-American community does, but they're less than half. So what you have then is by far a black-led city. Fine with me. Fine with me. You know where I am. Those of you listening to this podcast know where I am on all things racial. But the bottom line is that you have a city that's not majority black, and yet it's ruled by a largely black populated government. Now, not because it's ruled by blacks at all, but because it's extremely left-leaning politically. It's been an extremely failed government. It's been a highly corrupt government. Just look it up. The charges of allegation against council members, mayors, the ridiculous episodes of Marion Barry. I could just go on and on. It has been ridiculous, extremely left-leaning, extremely corrupt, and extremely incompetent. Okay? So this goes on since 1973. Now, what is that, 52 years? We've had home rule for D.C., and it's a joke. It's an embarrassment. The city has its beauty and has its parks and has its, it's controlled by the various police forces there, and there are many of them, the city police, the park police, the Capitol Police. I could go on and on. That's part of the problem in D.C. is you've got too many forces, too many military, too many folks in charge. It's hard to figure out who's in charge of what, and there are many squabbles that happen. Okay, the president's going to be at the such and such museum for a speech. Who's in charge? Who's running security? Who's got control of this entrance, etc.? It's a bit of a hassle, but the city's lovely. It's beautiful, except that you can't get a lot done. It's the People's Republic of Washington, D.C. Just try to move your household goods into a house in Washington, D.C. and look at the regulations you've got to deal with, the fees you've got to pay. And if you happen to live down along the mall, it's even worse for security reasons. So it's been a real mess. And I don't believe in home rule. I'm sorry. This has nothing to do with the African-American population, whom I love. It has nothing to do with any of the things you might suspect. It just hasn't worked. What Congress should have done prior to 1973 is create a governing body for Washington, D.C., which was its constitutional obligation, run it as a glorious federal city, work in league with private entities, and make it magnificent. Now, you know that I'm as quick to criticize Trump as I am to praise him, but it could be that he's the right guy to help set this thing right not because everything he does is perfect, but because he's already got vested interests in D.C., because he has helped to beautify D.C., because he's built one of the most amazing hotels in D.C., because he knows something about community development from an economic standpoint. And I don't believe that home rule is going to be undone. Don't misunderstand. I don't believe it's going to be undone. But I do like the fact that Trump has stepped in. I'm not sure he had to federalize the D.C. police force. That might be some bluster. And crime, by the way, violent crime was down over a 30-year period at the time that Trump stepped in and called it a hellhole. So there's a little bit of bluster and exaggeration here, as almost always attends almost everything Donald Trump does. But even Muriel Bowser, our mayor in D.C., went on the air yesterday, ticking off Democrats and D.C. residents, praising Donald Trump's police efforts in D.C. because other forms of crime have also dropped along with violent crime. One of the crime trends that was really on the rise was carjacking, which is terrifying, largely women with children in the back seat. You got thugs breaking in, ripping them out of their cars, driving off, sometimes with the children for a few blocks before they set them on the sidewalk. Ridiculous. So carjacking was rising dramatically. Muriel Bowser goes on the air here recently, the mayor, and says, well, it's worked. It's worked. Carjacking's dropped off like a stone. There's order being restored to the city. You see, the federal government should be ruling Washington, D.C. Now, I've just made the radical statement that I'm not in favor of home rule, and I'm not. But what I don't believe is that that's going to get reversed anytime soon. By the way, I don't believe in D.C. statehood for exactly the reasons the Founding Fathers didn't want the federal government to be in a state. I think you'd have pressure. I think you'd have undue control. I think you'd have the federal government at the behest and under the thumb of a state government. And by the way, if you turned D.C. into a state, it would be by far the smallest state. Its main business would be the federal government. It would be extremely left-leaning. It would only be about 600,000 or less voters. I mean, it would really be comical. There's another way to guarantee the citizens in Washington, D.C. can vote, which they should be able to do and they should be represented. You can divide the population up amongst the nearby states. You know, when you're in Washington, D.C. and you're driving around, you're actually venturing into nearby states without even knowing it. You can go from technical Washington, D.C. into Virginia, into Maryland, without even really knowing that you're doing it. Delaware, you can even sort of stray into Delaware if you go a little further. I mean, it's comical. So there's no problem dividing up the population of D.C. from the standpoint of representation and making sure that they are represented and that they're not being taxed without representation, an American value since the Revolution. These things could work. The problem is that Congress on this and 1,000 other issues is not fulfilling its purpose. Congress is broken. Congress is irresponsible. Congress is ineffective, the most ineffective branch of the federal government. And so as a result, in 73, they abnegated their responsibilities and voted for home rule to pass that situation off of their responsibility, and it has not worked. So Trump steps in his heavy-handed way, and even the mayor of D.C. is celebrating the fact that crime has dropped and order's been restored to the city, something she couldn't bring about because she doesn't have the resources, doesn't have control of federal police powers. Congress should be running Washington, D.C. Well, okay, if that's not going to happen, and I don't believe home rule is going to be overturned, and even though I think it was a mistake, still, there's a way for the federal government to exercise its responsibilities, work with the D.C. government, and turn D.C. into one of the greatest cities in the world. It is, I believe, already, but it definitely has some negatives. Crime is definitely an issue, and we can deal with that. But you can't do some of the stupid stuff that the D.C. City Council and the recent mayors have encouraged, like doing exactly what they did in California and raising the financial levels for criminal activity. That if you steal less than $1,000 from a store, so it's $950 worth, you haven't committed a felony. You haven't committed a serious crime. It's only a misdemeanor. That's like putting a sign out front of all your businesses saying, "Come rob me." And we already know in California, in many cities, Starbucks moves out, other businesses move out. In Nashville, Tennessee, In-N-Out Burger has just moved its headquarters there because they say we can't get anything, we can't run a store, we can't operate in California because of all the restrictive laws and the socialist government and the crime. It's tragic. Okay, we're talking about our national capital. And I want to say again, I want to park this here. I love Washington, D.C. I love its history. I love its beauty. I love its food. I love its buildings. I love what it does. I love that the nations come to it. And I love living there. But Congress didn't do its job, passed the governing of the city to a partial city government that doesn't work. Congress reserved in the Home Rule Bill some authority for itself. It needs to exercise that authority, develop a partnership with the city government, Congress, and commercial interests, and make it one of the most glorious capitals in the world. It can work, And even though I think that Trump has done this in a ham-handed fashion, he's put himself in the middle of something that needed to be addressed. And I'm grateful for this part of what he's doing. I'm grateful for the drop in crime. I'm grateful for the attention he's focusing on it. I'm grateful that Union Station, a building I love, have been visiting since my youth, adore what it has been, is now perhaps going to be restored, and it was becoming a haunt of the homeless and crime. Tragic. And Trump saying this does not befit our national capital. We need to fix it. Yes, I agree. Now let's do it right. Overturning home rule is probably not going to happen. You don't have support for it in Congress, but you better get the federal government involved, get commercial interests involved, and make Washington, D.C. the glorious city the nation deserves.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator in international media. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.